Right now, human body diversity spans an enormous range: different heights, builds, proportions, and countless other physical variations. But among this vast natural diversity, certain specific body types and physical traits actually occur considerably less frequently than others, some connected to unusual genetic variation, others to specific rare combinations of otherwise common traits. Let's dig into this properly, because answering this question actually requires carefully distinguishing between several truly different categories worth exploring separately. Let's start with an important clarification worth establishing clearly up front, because it shapes how to properly think about this entire topic. Rarest human body type doesn't have one single, universally agreed upon scientific definition, since researchers studying human physical variation examine numerous different specific traits, height, body proportion, muscle and fat distribution, and various specific genetic conditions affecting physical development, each involving its own separate rarity spectrum worth exploring individually, rather than collapsing into one single, oversimplified ranking. Let's talk about ectomorphic body type specifically first, because this represents one of the three broad body type categories researchers and fitness professionals commonly reference, worth exploring as a useful starting point. This particular classification system, while somewhat informal and not representing a precise, rigorously defined scientific category in the way certain other topics throughout this discussion will represent, generally describes individuals with naturally lean builds, minimal body fat, and difficulty gaining muscle mass even with deliberate strength training effort. Research suggests this particular general body type pattern, while certainly not rare in any extreme statistical sense, represents a less common pattern compared to the more average mixed body type most people naturally display, given how body composition tends to distribute along a continuous spectrum rather than clustering heavily around these three specific informal categories. Let's talk about extreme height variation too, because this represents a more precisely measurable, scientifically well-documented category worth exploring in additional depth. Both extremely tall and extremely short height, falling well outside typical population height distributions, represent seriously statistically rare physical traits, sometimes connected to specific documented genetic conditions affecting growth hormone production or bone development, and sometimes simply reflecting the extreme tail end of otherwise normal height variation without any specific identifiable underlying medical condition. Researchers studying human height distribution have found that height generally follows a predictable statistical pattern, with the vast majority of any given population clustering around an average height for that specific population, while individuals at the extreme ends of this distribution become increasingly statistically rare the further their specific height deviates from this population average. Let's talk about specific genetic conditions causing unusual physical development too, because this represents an important, medically significant category worth exploring specifically. Various documented genetic conditions can produce distinctive, statistically rare physical characteristics, including conditions affecting bone and connective tissue development, skin and hair pigmentation, and numerous other specific physical traits. These particular conditions typically occur at very low, specifically documented frequencies within the general population, and researchers studying human genetics have identified the specific genetic mechanisms responsible for many of these particular conditions with considerable scientific precision. Let's talk about situs inversus specifically too, because this represents a really fascinating, statistically rare anatomical condition worth exploring in additional depth. This particular condition involves a person's major internal organs developing in a mirror image arrangement compared to typical human anatomy, with the heart, liver, and other organs positioned on the opposite side of the body compared to their usual typical location. This condition occurs in a very small percentage of the general population, and researchers have identified specific genetic factors connected to its development, though many people with this particular condition experience no significant health complications whatsoever, and frequently remain entirely unaware of their own unusual internal anatomy unless it happens to be discovered incidentally through unrelated medical imaging or examination. Let's talk about extremely rare blood types too, because this represents another interesting, well-documented category of human biological rarity worth exploring specifically, even though it doesn't directly connect to visible physical body type in the way the other examples throughout this discussion do. Certain specific blood types occur at such statistically low frequencies that only a small number of confirmed individuals worldwide have ever been documented possessing that particular specific blood type. Representing one of the more extreme documented examples of genuine human biological rarity. Worth mentioning specifically, even though it falls slightly outside the more visibly apparent body type categories, this discussion has primarily focused on throughout the rest of this topic. Let's talk about muscle fiber composition variation too, because this represents an interesting, less visibly obvious, but scientifically well-documented category worth exploring in additional depth. Human muscles contain different proportions of specific fiber types, generally categorized as fast twitch fibers, better suited to short, powerful bursts of activity, and slow twitch fibers, better suited to sustained endurance activity, with most people possessing a fairly typical mixed ratio of these two fiber types. However, some individuals possess unusually extreme ratios strongly favoring one particular fiber type. An actually rare physical characteristic that researchers have found correlates meaningfully with exceptional natural athletic capability in either explosive power sports or endurance-focused activities specifically, depending on which particular fiber type happens to predominate within that specific individual's unusual muscle composition. Let's talk about specific documented cases of extreme physical rarity involving multiple compounding rare traits too, because this represents a particularly interesting category worth exploring in additional depth. Researchers occasionally document individuals possessing several independently rare physical traits simultaneously, and since these individual traits generally occur independently of each other genetically, the mathematical probability of any single individual possessing multiple specific rare traits together becomes dramatically lower, with each additional rare trait involved, following basic principles of statistical probability already well understood by researchers studying human genetic variation more broadly. This detail is worth appreciating because it illustrates an important mathematical principle relevant throughout this entire discussion. While any single rare trait might occur in a meaningful, documented percentage of the general population, the combination of multiple independent rare traits occurring together within one single individual becomes exponentially rarer, helping explain why certain specific documented individuals sometimes receive considerable medical and scientific research attention, specifically because of this kind of unusual, compounding rarity. Let's talk about twin studies and what they've revealed regarding physical trait heritability too, because this represents an important, scientifically valuable research methodology worth exploring specifically. Researchers studying identical twins who share essentially identical genetic material compared against fraternal twins who share roughly the same genetic similarity as typical siblings, have been able to determine with considerable scientific precision exactly how much specific physical traits depend on genetic factors versus environmental factors including nutrition, physical activity, and various other lifestyle circumstances. This research has found that certain physical traits, including height specifically, show remarkably high genetic heritability, while other traits, including specific body fat distribution and muscle development, show somewhat more significant environmental influence alongside their underlying genetic component, helping researchers better understand exactly why certain rare physical traits and body types actually develop and persist within specific individuals and family lineages. Let's talk about skeletal variation research and what it reveals about human physical diversity too, because this represents another valuable, scientifically grounded research area worth exploring in additional depth. Researchers studying human skeletal remains, both from contemporary medical imaging and from archaeological skeletal collections, have documented considerable variation in bone structure, proportion, and density across different individuals and populations, allowing researchers to establish detailed baseline data regarding exactly which specific skeletal variations occur commonly, versus which represent genuine statistical outliers worth considering rare by careful scientific standards. This research has proven particularly valuable for properly understanding historical and even prehistoric human physical variation, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding early human physical development and evolutionary history more generally. Let's talk about conjoined twins as an extreme example of physical rarity worth exploring specifically too, because this represents one of the most statistically rare, well-documented forms of human physical variation worth including in this broader discussion. This particular condition, involving twins whose bodies remain physically joined together following incomplete separation during very early embryonic development, occurs at an extremely low, precisely documented frequency. Representing one of the rarest confirmed forms of human physical development researchers have extensively studied and documented. Medical researchers have identified several different specific patterns this condition can take, depending on exactly where and how extensively the twins' bodies remain physically connected, each specific pattern occurring at its own particular documented frequency within this already extremely rare, broader category. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about polydactyly, meaning having extra fingers or toes too, because this represents another interesting, moderately well-documented example of human physical variation worth exploring specifically. This particular condition, while certainly less common than typical 5-fingered, 5-toed hand and foot development, actually occurs considerably more frequently than many people probably assume, particularly within certain specific population groups where researchers have identified specific genetic factors contributing to somewhat elevated frequency compared to the broader general population. This detail is worth including because it illustrates an important point worth appreciating throughout this entire discussion. Rarity itself isn't always uniform across the entire global population, with certain specific traits occurring considerably more or less frequently, depending on specific population genetics and historical patterns of genetic inheritance within particular geographic regions and communities. Let's talk about extreme flexibility and joint hypermobility conditions too, because this represents another interesting category worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Some individuals possess truly unusual joint flexibility, sometimes connected to specific documented genetic conditions affecting connective tissue structure and composition, allowing for a considerably greater range of joint movement compared to typical human joint flexibility. While mild hypermobility occurs relatively commonly within the general population, the more extreme documented cases, sometimes connected to specific genetic conditions researchers have identified and studied in considerable detail, represent seriously rare physical characteristics worth including within this broader discussion of unusual human physical variation and capability. Let's talk about how researchers actually calculate and express these various rarity statistics too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly before wrapping up this broader discussion. Researchers typically express trait rarity using precise statistical frequency measurements based on large-scale population sampling and genetic database research, allowing for considerably more precise, scientifically confident rarity claims compared to casual popular estimates that sometimes circulate without any solid underlying statistical foundation or verification. This careful statistical approach matters considerably for properly understanding this entire topic, since popular claims regarding trait rarity sometimes significantly overstate or understate actual documented frequency, depending on the specific quality and rigor of whatever original research or casual claim that particular popular statistic actually happened to originate from in the first place. Let's talk about how researchers actually study and measure human physical rarity scientifically too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers rely on large-scale population studies and genetic databases specifically designed to establish accurate baseline frequency data for various physical traits and conditions, allowing researchers to confidently determine exactly how statistically rare a given specific physical characteristic actually proves to be within a broader, well-documented population sample, rather than relying purely on casual, anecdotal impression or limited, unrepresentative local observation alone. Let's talk about gigantism and dwarfism. As specific, Medically well-documented conditions worth exploring in additional depth too, because these represent particularly clear, extensively studied examples of genuine physical rarity worth including specifically before continuing this broader discussion. Gigantism, typically resulting from excessive growth hormone production during childhood development, and various forms of dwarfism involving significantly restricted bone growth connected to specific documented genetic factors, both represent well-characterized medical conditions occurring at precisely documented, statistically low frequencies within the general population. Researchers have identified the specific underlying genetic and hormonal mechanisms responsible for many different forms of these conditions, allowing for considerably more precise scientific understanding compared to earlier historical periods when these conditions were understood considerably less completely and sometimes treated with significant social stigma, rather than the more scientifically informed, medically appropriate understanding these particular conditions generally received today. Let's talk about albinism specifically too, because this represents another well-documented, scientifically well-understood example of genuine human physical rarity worth exploring in additional depth. This particular condition, involving significantly reduced or entirely absent melanin production affecting skin, hair, and eye pigmentation, occurs at a specifically documented, relatively low frequency within the general population. Though this frequency varies somewhat across different specific populations and regions, connected to specific documented genetic factors researchers have identified and studied extensively. This detail reinforces a pattern already touched on earlier throughout this discussion, regarding how certain rare traits show meaningfully different documented frequency depending on specific population genetics. Rather than occurring at precisely uniform frequency across every single human population worldwide without any meaningful regional or ancestral variation. Let's talk about how modern genome sequencing technology has dramatically expanded scientific understanding of human physical rarity too, because this represents an important, actively developing research area worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. Increasingly affordable, increasingly widespread genetic sequencing technology has allowed researchers to identify and precisely characterize an ever-growing catalog of specific genetic variants connected to unusual physical traits and conditions, considerably expanding scientific understanding beyond what was possible using only the more limited observational and statistical methods available to researchers throughout most of the 20th century. This ongoing technological advancement continues actively revealing new specific genetic factors connected to human physical rarity, suggesting current scientific understanding of this broader topic, while already considerably more detailed and precise than in previous historical periods, likely still represents an incomplete, continuously developing picture rather than a fully finished, complete scientific catalog of every possible form of genuine human physical rarity and variation. Let's talk about how researchers distinguish between truly rare genetic conditions and simply unusual but statistically common variation too, because this represents an important conceptual distinction worth addressing directly before this discussion concludes. Not every unusual physical trait necessarily connects to a specific, rare genetic mutation, since human physical variation more broadly includes considerable natural diversity that, while individually distinctive or unusual seeming from a casual, personal perspective, still falls within the broader range of typical human variation. Researchers generally consider statistically common rather than truly rare by careful scientific standards. This distinction matters considerably for properly understanding this entire topic, since casually labeling any personally unusual or distinctive physical trait as rare without actual supporting population-level statistical data risks conflating genuine, scientifically documented rarity with simple personal or cultural unfamiliarity regarding the actual broader range of typical human physical diversity and variation. Let's talk about how genetics specifically determines much of this observed physical variation too, because this represents an important underlying biological consideration worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Human physical traits generally result from complex interactions between numerous different genes, alongside environmental factors including nutrition and physical activity. meaning most visible physical variation reflects this complex, multifaceted combination of factors rather than any single, simple genetic switch determining a given specific trait in isolation. This detail helps explain why certain physical traits show continuous, gradual variation across the general population, while other more specific conditions, connected to particular single gene mutations, tend to show more clearly distinct, categorical presence or absence within a given individual, rather than existing along the same kind of continuous spectrum. Let's talk about how cultural and historical factors have shaped popular perception regarding body type rarity too, because this represents an interesting, closely related dimension worth exploring specifically. Popular media and cultural representation frequently emphasize certain specific body types as ideal or desirable, sometimes creating a skewed popular perception regarding which specific body types actually represent genuine statistical rarity compared to which body types simply receive disproportionate cultural attention and representation despite being considerably more common than popular media portrayal might otherwise suggest. This detail is worth including because it illustrates an important distinction worth carrying through this entire discussion. Genuine statistical rarity, confirmed through careful population research, doesn't always align with popular cultural assumptions regarding which specific body types actually qualify as unusual or rare. Let's talk briefly about the ethical considerations researchers navigate when studying human physical rarity too, because this represents a fitting, worthwhile final point before this discussion concludes. Researchers studying rare genetic conditions and unusual physical traits generally emphasize treating affected individuals with appropriate dignity and respect, avoiding language or framing that might inadvertently stigmatize or exoticize people who happen to possess these particular documented rare traits, since a scientifically rare characteristic doesn't reflect anything meaningfully different regarding an individual's basic worth, capability, or humanity. This ethical consideration matters considerably for how this entire topic gets discussed and presented more generally, since genuine scientific curiosity regarding human physical diversity and rarity can, and should, coexist comfortably with appropriate respect and sensitivity toward the actual individuals whose bodies happen to display these particular rare, scientifically documented characteristics and variations. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full answer to what represents the rarest human body type turns out to depend considerably on which specific physical trait or category you're actually asking about, rather than representing any single, simple answer. Extreme height variation, specific genetic conditions like situs, versus extremely rare blood types, and unusual muscle fiber composition all represent truly documented, scientifically confirmed categories of human physical rarity, each occurring at meaningfully low frequencies within the general population, though the specific degree of rarity varies considerably depending on exactly which particular trait or condition you're examining. So the next time this seriously interesting topic comes up in casual conversation, it's worth appreciating that human physical rarity actually spans numerous different, scientifically distinct categories rather than representing one single, simple ranking of unusual body types, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If human physical variation actually turns out to be this scientifically complex and multidimensional, involving numerous really separate categories of rarity rather than one single, simple spectrum, what does that suggest about how carefully we should generally approach popular claims regarding which specific human physical traits actually qualify as rare or unusual, especially when those claims come from casual cultural assumption rather than actual population-level scientific research?